Stratfordians, Oxfordians, Baconians, Novellians, Marlovians, Sidneyans. All of these little catchy terms are used to sort of, pitch a favorite author for the works known as Shakespeare, the 36 plus plays and hundreds of sonnets, and these terms are used to sort of encapsulate the idea that one singular person has written the majority of, if not all, of the works known as Shakespeare. But although each of these different camps have their own strong claims to this throne, once you start trying to cross-diagram some of their movements and philosophies and connections, this sort of singular idea of one person running this stuff starts to make it a little harder to digest. And so today we're going to be analyzing an essay by Stephanie Hopkins Hughes, who is going to be talking about the expanded authorship question. And I think you're in for a real treat into some of how me and Chance have really gone about some of this research, so stick around.
Welcome, folks. Back here with another one. I hope you enjoyed our last one. If you did not check out our Macbeth video, give that one a look. Seemed to go, a little mini viral. So got some new subscribers from that. Hopefully you guys are in for some of this more dense, research-based, scholarly kind of stuff. We try to make it a little lighter, a little more fun. Today's is a lot of fun. I'm super excited about this one. This one, sorry guys, allergy season. This one could have very well been maybe our first episode, right?
Pretty much.
This is an essay that we've been thinking about for a long time here. And, the way Brady intros it is kind of how it's opened up our thinking, but that's not really necessarily the direction that Stephanie is going with this. Stephanie is a big-time Oxfordian. And she wants to open up this question of authorship to not just Shakespeare, but to a whole host of Elizabethan and Jacobean writers, because we don't have a lot of documentation of a lot of these folks, and a lot of them seem to write in the, vein and style and of the caliber of Shakespeare. So, thank you, Brady. Today, let's see. This is an essay from 2005. It's called Beyond Shakespeare, Expanding the Authorship Theory. Let's see. You want to pop it up on the screen there? Stephanie Hopkins Hughes wrote this, and it's a quick little essay. We'll link it in the info. You guys should totally check it out if you haven't. I know plenty of you Oxfordians have. And I'll be honest, I don't agree with everything Stephanie's saying in this essay, but I think she has a major point. We got some charts to go along with this because I don't think she goes quite far enough. But we'll put a chart that shows a whole host of names. So it says, the question of who sorry guys, the question of who actually wrote the Shakespeare canon is one that goes back many years, decades even. Possibly centuries. How far back we can only guess. And
biblical times.
I know a lot of Shakespeare authorship questioners have done a lot of research on this, and it goes back to the time of Shakespeare itself.
As we've shown in our other earlier episodes too, right?
And one easy example is the Parnassus plays. I found a blog today that was showing that the Parnassus plays were evidence that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And that seemed incredibly dubious to me because, as John Stotzenberg shows in his essay, The Impartial Study of the Title Page, that the references in Parnassus play are pointing to Thomas Dekker, not to Shakespeare, so why is the Shakespeare name getting used when these references are for Dekker? That said, who the heck is Thomas Dekker? We've had that video. All these questions will be in this here, so let's see. Some think that not without a reason that the question is as old as the canon itself, that originally there had to have been a community of writers, theater devotees, and patrons, Patreon, shout out, patrons who knew for a fact the identity of the true author, and who therefore must have handed down their certain knowledge from one generation to the next, to close friends, intimate family members, at first as a secret, later as the kind of knowledge that couldn't be allowed for reasons of politics or class solidarity to enter the public record, and so what began as certain knowledge gradually faded to uncertainty, then to rumor, and finally to silence. Or, as other people might say, to myth, to legend, to lore.
Or to crack foolery or whatever, right?
Yeah. To crazy fringe theory.
Yes.
When it rose again to the surface, whether again for the first time in the 19th century, it took the form in which we have it today, namely that Shakespeare must have been one candidate or another. First Francis Bacon, then with the failure of Bacon, which I don't know that the failure of Bacon's ever been proven, but with the,
conclusivity, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Like, inconclusivity. And, I think a lot of people were finding the authorship question independent of them hearing about Bacon, and so they're off on the search finding other people when they didn't even see the evidence for Bacon, which is maybe how a lot of Oxfordians feel now when people go off and, they hear the authorship question for the first time and they hear some Marlowe stuff, and those Oxfordians are like, no, that's, you need to hear our theory, and I'm sure Baconians back in the day probably maybe felt like that, probably still do. So I don't know about failure, but let's continue. And a handful of others, among them the Earl of Oxford. And Oxford doesn't come around for 60 or 70 years, to be fair. From some point, the need for a single candidate was matched by the so-called group theory. So she's already kind of got her dates backwards because she wants to say that it started with Bacon, but it doesn't. It starts with Delia Bacon's group theory. Technically, somebody wrote about Bacon before her, but that was only in a letter, and it was like a 2-page letter, and it was just some guy saying, I think it's weird, but maybe Bacon possibly wrote Shakespeare, but no, Delia Bacon that same year wrote a 1,000-page tome about a whole host of people. So no, Bacon is the original, alternate theory to Shakespeare is not true. It's really a Delia Bacon's group theory. She had it already going before this guy wrote that little letter over in Britain.
See, maybe
shots fired.
I know that you said that we should have started with this one, but shout out to Delia Bacon and some of that earlier stuff that we talked about, and although her writing as you go through it, the linguistic syntax is kind of is really wonky and really hard to kind of
she's definitely a little bit of a crazy person.
Yeah, but it's
crazy good writer though.
I totally get it though. Yeah, it's like, oh my god, you maybe just don't have some of the modern vernacular that we have to sort of been like
to be fair, Delia, if she was around these days,
Ultra Magic,
she would be on the forums back in the Reddit days, but not to discredit Stephanie's essay here, but I want to point out that already she's pivoting group theory as this intrusive, invasive species of thought, and that shouldn't have come in. And you'll see later that there's reasons for me saying this, but no, group theory is it's maybe not been around since the 1600s, maybe has, I'm not sure, but group theory is the basis for all modern Shakespeare authorship questioning. So anybody that thinks group theories is wacky, horrible idea, you better be thankful it came around, or else you wouldn't be able to have your Oxford theory, would you? Better thank that crazy lady. Which, she's not just a crazy lady, she dealt with schizophrenia that became worse as she got older, but she was a very successful novelist in her time. The preface to that book is written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is agnostic, I would say, on the Shakespeare authorship question. He never fully endorses the Shakespeare authorship question, but clearly endorses it enough to write a 50-page preface.
Yeah,
for this
teases with it.
He's definitely he's sat curious. So let me see. Continuing. Was matched by the so-called group theory that attempts to solve the problems posed by this plethora of candidates by imagining that some or all of them work together in some way to create the canon we label Shakespeare's. And I don't know that work together is totally a fair statement, though I don't know that that's necessarily off base either. The big drawback to this lack of certainty is that it leaves us open to ridicule. who hasn't heard the standard opening line from journalists and other commentators? And she waxes on a little silly here, but basically saying that, like, because of this giant number of candidates, nobody takes this seriously. And you can see that if you ever go watch the Timeline documentary on YouTube that has Peter Amundson's theory. They feature little bits of Stanley Wells being interviewed by the guy that does the documentary. I forget his name. But Stanley Wells is like big time Stratfordian, big time. He's like the guard, and he's this old codger that almost seems senile, honestly.
No.
Shots fired. Sorry, guys. But he says because that there's 80 plus candidates, that must mean that there is no authorship question. And like, to me, that's such backwards like logic that, like, well, no, like, if there was an authorship question, why would we come up with one candidate, much less 81? Like, clearly the question's such a big question that, like, 81 still hasn't answered it. We're probably up to more now. Like, that number's gonna keep ticking, baby. And like, you leave people like me and Brady up to, you know. So continuing on. So what most of these scholars, or sorry, not scholars, what most of these folks don't know, thank goodness, is that there's a whole other layer, or as we say down here in Houston, whole nother layer to this problem of too many hands, namely too many works. And what does she mean? Too many hands, too many works. Well, she's alluding to the fact that, like, yeah, as much as Shakespeare's up to doubt, there's like 600 plays that we have in print, and there's probably double, triple, more than that we don't have in print from that era. Who's writing all that other stuff? As we showed in our Henslow Diary video, our Thomas More video, our Francis Mears video, yeah, there's a good amount of names, but it's not that large of a set. And furthermore, like, if you take away the Henslow names, like, you're left with a very small group of people who is having this gigantic output. And not just that, in a good chunk of these, like, there seems to be the same kind of reasons that one wants to doubt Shakespeare. You might want to doubt the authors of some of these other plays because they seem to have a lot of the same, not just literary capabilities, folks. It's not just about talent or craft ability. It's about, esoteric knowledge, academic knowledge, classical knowledge, medical knowledge, knowledge of law. That stuff pops up in these other guys too, and poets, playwrights alike. I kind of want to focus on the playwrights today because that's the chart that I made, but we could go down a whole road of poets as well, and once I get that chart put together, we can follow up on that, and she will mention both, because Shakespeare was both, right? As were a lot of folks. Once you get into the material and begin to read the works of other writers of the period, you realize that there are quite a few plays and poems that sound too much like early Shakespeare to be ignored. And I don't even know that early Shakespeare needs to be said. Like, you can say that prime Shakespeare. Like, John Webster sounds a lot like prime Shakespeare. Marston, and when he gets to his prime, he sounds a lot like prime Shakespeare. And so it's like, I don't even know that it's just early Shakespeare, although early Shakespeare definitely comes into play when she's going to focus mostly on the 80s guys, but that's why I think she's missing a little bit, because if once you go in the 90s and you get that whole Henslow group, like, it's not just that university wits guys that's like 5, 6, 7, 8 dudes. Like, Henslow group, you get 20 guys, you know, and then you can go onwards from there, and you can count some of the later guys, like maybe Fletcher and Beaumont even, although at some point I don't care about some of these playwrights. Like, I don't know if I care. Fletcher's alright. I kind of like Fletcher. Folks, tell me why we should care at all who Beaumont is. Like,
what did he write again?
Night of the Burning Pestle.
Okay.
And that's like this weird meta play where the main character, the actor that's going to play it, is like somebody picked out of the crowd.
Oh, yeah.
And then, like, the whole time the play is going, his mom and dad are, like, commentating on the play and, like, telling him how good of a job he's doing and rooting him on. And it, like, interrupts the play's, like, plot movement to do this. And it's maybe a nifty experimental trick, but It's awful. It's clunky. I hate his parents. I want them to die. Maybe they do die later. I didn't make it long enough. That would be the only sort of catharsis or resolution for me. But continuing on. Yeah, not a Beaumont fan. Confronted with the possibility that Shakespeare, whoever he was, wrote a great deal more than the 38 plays and 200 poems attributed to him, plays and poems that either have no known author or are attributed to a dozen otherwise unknown individuals, one is forced to come up with an explanation, and not surprisingly, the explanations have been as various and some as ridiculous as the theories of who wrote the accepted canon. And so she's saying, like, look, there's not just Shakespeare plays that are up for question. There's Shakespeare Apocrypha that's up for question. And then the people that we try to answer some of that Apocrypha with are as, like, dubious as Shakespeare, like Thomas Dekker or Thomas Middleton. Like, how and when are they getting into these circles? Also, at some point, if Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare, like, it's just a kind of common sense thing, which I know some folks don't like common sense or Occam's razor, but, like, just generally speaking, this isn't a proof, but if one guy is doing it...
If the most famous of the guys we get, pedestaled all the time, if that guy is not even true,
yeah,
why is Ben Jonson?
What are the odds
why
that,
is
like,
Marlowe?
Every other one is exactly true?
Yeah.
What are the odds? Like, seriously, like, what kind of vacuum would make that happen?
And yeah, you have to immediately question, like, oh, Ben Jonson's talking to Shakespeare, but if someone is like, no, I don't think Shakespeare is real, but then how is that going to work with Jonson either way?
Yeah, when and where did Ben Jonson meet de Vere? And then, like...
Oh, no, Jonson, remember, also knew what Philip Sidney was going to have planned for the rest of his Arcadia, right?
Right,
yeah.
like, when and how? Ben
whatever.
Jonson's, like, he's, like, 22 years younger than Oxford. He's 18 years younger than Sidney. When and how is he learning this stuff? Sidney dies when he's 14 or 13. How? When? Where do...
Destiny.
He's a bricklayer's son. Oh, he just learns it from Sidney's friends after? Then, like...
Cosmic providence.
Yeah, I don't know. Alright. Forced by our rejection of the untenable Stratford biography... And so this is for post-Stratfordians. If you folks out there think that Shakespeare's Shakespeare, it's totally fine. Stick around for this, because this isn't just about Shakespeare. Okay? So if you don't like the idea that Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare and that's untenable for you, like, stick around to see if any of the rest of this makes any sense. And I know most folks here are totally on board with that, so yeah, let's continue. One can hardly call it a theory that on the one hand gives us no certifiable candidate, and on the other gives us no certifiable canon. After a century and a half of study, we are not only still without an author, we have added an immense new problem, that the canon itself may be a good deal larger and more diverse than we had thought. And that's completely true. Like, I think no matter who you think Shakespeare is, like, and no matter, like, which other extra plays you think Shakespeare wrote, like, every one of these guys, whether it's Brian Vickers or McDonald Jackson, who are big time, mainstream mainstream scholars that do attribution stuff, like, Vickers is all about Kyd and McDonald Jackson's all about Shakespeare, but both of them will still attribute extra stuff to Shakespeare. Marlovians will obviously attribute extra stuff to Shakespeare. Oxfordians will attribute tons of the, early stuff, the Robert Greene and...
The Lily and the Kid or whatever, right?
Right, and the anonymous early stuff that's like Edmund Ironside or stuff like that. So, like, pretty much everybody does this, but nobody's really totally agreed on what is and isn't Shakespeare, where to draw the line, how to date these plays, and... So it's like, all right, we have to, like, take a step back, because at some point, like, no way one individual's writing every single one of these, right? Like, sorry, Bastian Conrad, but no, not one individual is writing 80, 100, 200 plays. They can be a part of 80 plays, but completely writing it all themselves, that's a little ridiculous, and the stylistic evidence doesn't really show that anyway. So it seems like there's got to be at least some people helping, if we want to call 50, 60, 70, 80 plays all by Shakespeare, then like certainly there's other hands in it, and I think mainstream scholars have totally opened up to that idea and have started placing names in there. I don't think a lot of us necessarily agree with those names, and as she'll show here, maybe we should even question some of those names themselves, like Marlowe, Kidd, although she doesn't say Marlowe. We'll get to that. So no wonder that at a conference of Orthodox scholars, Shakespeare Association of America, some years ago, when the authorship question rose, one of the conferees dismissed it as a can of worms. We may disagree with their adherence to the biography, but we can hardly condemn them for their distaste for the alternatives. Because too many candidates have accumulated, the discourse has become stuck at a point we should have passed long ago. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I know a lot of Oxfordians agree with that, and I think that's where some of the hatred for the Philip Sidney stuff comes from. Is that they feel like, look, we've already jam-packed this with 80-something candidates. You guys here, Brady and Chance, you're pulling out this Philip Sidney guy, which, yeah, nobody was really seriously considering, but if you guys keep talking about him, they may start to seriously consider it, and, like, now we have to freaking compete with Philip Sidney? Like, nobody wants to compete with that guy. That guy's awesome. He's great at everything. He's a perfect candidate. Thank God he died in 86. Or did he? Check out our Philip Sidney video, True Shakespeare, episode 8? 6?
5.
Just check it out. Yeah, too much time.
Too much time and energy is spent arguing which one, or ones, wrote the Shakespeare canon, since it seems impossible at this point to reduce the size of this group, to which new names are being added all the time. The better path may be open to up the question in a way that would admit all of them. We need to stop focusing on the candidacy of Shakespeare, stop fighting over who should be eliminated, and embrace a more comprehensive authorship thesis, one that includes all the writers of the period and all the works. You know, kind of a Buckridge sort of take, or
yeah,
kind of stance too, right? This does not mean endorsing the idea that there were co-authors of the Shakespeare canon, at least not in the sense that Brian Vicker advocates, whereby Shakespeare and some others sat down together and decided who should write which act of the so-called late plays, a process he describes in his recent book, Shakespeare Co-Author, a process that, according to Dean Keith Simonton, professor of psychology at the University of California at Davis, is most unlikely.
I'm glad she asked a psychology professor how Renaissance theater may or may not have worked. Like, thank you, Dean Keith Simonton, for your info. Next, if we want to look into Italian Renaissance painting, we'll go seek out some dentists, and then maybe after that, I could go on.
Yeah. Oh my lord.
So, like, clearly she's got a bent against co-authorship or collaboration, right?
What do you think is the reason for that?
Well, because she's an Oxfordian, and she wants to say that Edward de Vere is the sole pen of 100% of Shakespeare, which, you know, she's, like, not shy about it. She does sort of romanticize and pedestalize Edward de Vere. She thinks that all the bad press that we have, that he may or may not have sexually abused a bunch of kids, that he murdered somebody, that he constantly...
Not very nice to his daughter and wife.
That's all a lot of bad press drummed up by the Cecil family and has continued over decades and centuries. And maybe there's some truth to that, but, like, it does border a little apologetic.
Right.
And she does seem to like the idea that he is this grandiose genius, singular
underdog figure. Who's been
that is very much
trampled underfoot or something.
Very much a Mozart figure, that, like, we should be heralding him as equal to Newton, Mozart, and Einstein and that kind of thing. And that, like, I guess, to be fair, if you think he's Shakespeare, that's maybe not.
Yeah, if it's really what you believe, then yes, he should be recognized for the work done.
Right. But that said, like, already we're clearly seeing that she's really pulling some cards out to, like, make sure that we don't like the idea of co-authorship.
Yeah, I definitely thought this line was suspect too.
Which, shout out. Okay, we're gonna keep going with Simonton. Let's keep going.
So Simonton, the leading force behind the newly developing branch of psychology known as the psychology of creativity, has spent much of his career studying the nature of genius. With facts derived from scientific methods and clinical studies, he assures us, as if our own experience and common sense did not, that creating art by committee just doesn't work. According to Simonton, quote, experimental research has actually demonstrated rather conclusively that group problem solving using more egalitarian brainstorming techniques usually yields dismal results in comparison with more solitary forms of problem solving. Individuals working alone will generate more and better ideas than will the same individuals working in a group, which should explain why those plays that, as Vickers demonstrates, were co-authored by lesser writers, are among the weakest in the Shakespeare canon. Nor does Vickers, for all his grasp of things literary, pause to consider why in the world Shakespeare, unlike every other artistic genius under the sun, would stoop to sharing a work with a poor fish like George Wilkins. Did the world's greatest writer, at the peak of his career, lose interest in writing? This would make him unique among the world's greatest writers.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. Can we unpack a little bit of this? Okay, first of all, one of these lines like backs up Vickers' point, and I'm kind of a little curious like why she put that in there. Which should explain why those plays that, as Vickers demonstrates, were co-authored by lesser writers are among the weakest in the Shakespeare canon. So, like, is she agreeing with him that, like, yeah, the weakest plays in the Shakespeare canon are indeed the ones that are working with lesser writers? Like, is that, or is she saying that's what he's saying, and that's why it seems to make sense, but don't fall for, like, I don't know what her point is there. But then, she has a good point, like, what is Shakespeare doing with George Wilkins? But here's the thing. I've been reading a little bit about George Wilkins, like literally today. I was reading about some Shakespeare Apocrypha. George Wilkins is supposed to be the guy that maybe helped write a Yorkshire Tragedy, which is printed as a Shakespeare play, but now people say is now a Middleton play. But George Wilkins is supposed to be the guy that also helps write Pericles. Which Pericles is like one that's not originally printed in the folio, but it's one that gets added to the later folios, and so it's one of the, we said 36 plus in our intro, it's one of the plus, and a lot of people, including me, it's like, this play's crap, dude, and so Oxfordians are like, yes, it's crap, but that's because de Vere wrote it when he's like 2, like, no. But no, that it was written in like the 60s or 70s when de Vere is younger. It's one of the early plays. Okay. And that, like, yeah, maybe gets touched up a little bit, but it doesn't get the full treatment.
So this is them being like, oh yeah, here's like a studio version, you know, of like some kind of song or from the first album or whatever. Right. Yeah, this is the demo tape,
yeah,
right? Yeah, there you go.
And but mainstream Orthodox scholars are like, no, it wasn't an early play. It was just written by a dunce named George Wilkins. But
how did he get? Yeah.
But Shakespeare had to touch it up because if he didn't, no way anybody would watch it. And
so he's just helping up old George.
Old George, but like part of the problem is that like when that attribution was first made, it was still believed that George Wilkins was the writer of Yorkshire Tragedy, and that Shakespeare's name on Yorkshire Tragedy showed that Shakespeare and Wilkins were working together. But now that whole Wilkins writing Yorkshire Tragedy thing's sort of been pushed away and debunked, and we say it's Middleton, but we haven't taken away that Wilkins and Pericles attribution.
Okay.
And so it's like, and the reason that we say Wilkins wrote any of these plays is that he supposedly wrote the pamphlets or the tracts that, like, just the, you know, almost the magazine article or the newspaper article that these plays are getting based on. And so people are like, well, he wrote the article, must have wrote the play. And it's like, and like, I don't even think, like, I don't have him on our playwright list. I was going to add him today, and then I read those essays, and I was like, okay, Adam, take him off. He's gone. Thank you. George Wilkins, not a guy. Who cares? Because I think every play that gets attributed to him can be attributed to another writer, and we can just say that this thing was quickly hacked out based on the pamphlet. And so it's like, we don't really need to have George Wilkins in the conversation. But her point is correct, that, like, if the mainstream view is that he's writing with George Wilkins, why in the heck is some great writer like Shakespeare writing with George Wilkins, like, kind of right at after the height of his career, like, still coming off the peak, writing things like Lear and Coriolanus, like, still hasn't even written The Tempest? Why is he thinking to write crappy old Pericles with George Wilkins? So she has a great point there. But that said, like, that's kind of a pot shot, and, like, how about let's ask better questions, like, why would he be writing with Thomas Middleton or John Webster, stuff like that? And it's like, because those guys are pretty good.
Be assured, we're not looking for more than one Shakespeare.
We are.
But we are looking for the other characters in his story. If we wish to find Shakespeare, we must seek to find him among his fellows, the actors, patrons, publishers, and most important, the other writers who shared in the creation, not just of the Shakespeare canon, but of all English Renaissance literature.
Here.
If Shakespeare were the only authorship problem of the period, scholars should have found the solution long ago. If a doctor questions a patient suffering from a mysterious disease, his diagnosis for that patient must be affected when he learns that the patient's entire community suffers from the same symptoms. Diagnosing the patient will do little good if the real problem lies with his environment, for it is not just the authorship of Shakespeare, but the authorship of just about everything that qualifies as the literature of the Elizabethan era, by which I mean literature of the imagination, that is, all poetry, all plays, all romance tales, songs, and satires, for when it comes to authorship, all are just as dubious as Shakespeare. It is a fact that we do not know for certain who wrote, not just Shakespeare, but just about everything that qualifies as imaginative literature that was written during the very period in English history that saw the most ebullient uprush of literary art ever produced in the West.
So, she's kind of restating that and hasn't really given us exact evidence of it, but I think she will here. And if she doesn't, we'll provide some ourselves. And honestly, it's not even just fiction. She was like alluding to that it's just fiction. It's not just fiction. It's these pamphlet wars, right? Who the heck's writing these
satires?
Yeah, who's writing these pamphlets, man? And maybe that counts as satires. But like even things like the King James Bible, right? Let's see. Roll from here. The authorship question is not just about Shakespeare. It's about Shakespeare plus Bacon, plus Sidney, plus Philip Sidney, plus Mary Sidney, plus Christopher Marlowe, plus Ben Jonson, plus Robert Greene, plus Thomas Watson, plus George Gascon, plus Richard Edwards, plus the host of names that most readers have never heard of. The problems that plague Shakespeare's authorship plague every single member of his creative community to a greater or lesser degree. Whatever the reasons for this, they go well beyond the problem of Shakespeare alone. So for now, we'll leave aside Shakespeare's problems, such as the fact that, like many of his comic characters, his name is a pun on his fiction. Will Shakespeare. How often do authors have such names as a matter of sheer coincidence? A name that not only provides a perfectly tuned pun, but that also forms a sentence, complete with subject, understood, verb in the future tense, one that describes blah blah. She's just talking about Shakespeare's name. I'm gonna move on. Two groups of writers. This community can be roughly divided into two groups. We'll call one group commoners and the other court writers. And so already she's sort of making a classist distinction, which I know a lot of mainstream folks are like, all right, this is already starting to sound elitist. And maybe the people researching this have elitist tendencies, but I don't know that that's necessarily fair to say that what she's doing itself is elitist, because what she's trying to point out is that most of the people that are playwrights are of middle class, working class stock, at best like gentlemen. We don't really have any noble, aristocratic writers doing plays. Maybe some poems, but those aren't like commercial ventures, and if they are, it's more commercial ventures for the printer and publisher than the poetic writer. And so like we have this group of people that are all working class trying to make a bunch of money, but then we also have this other group of people that are of aristocratic stock, that have insanely good educations, that have nothing but free time to write. Well, that maybe that part's up for argument. Some of these folks have nothing but free time to write, and so much of the learning and knowledge shown in the plays seems to point to this group and not the other group. And so where's the disconnect happening? What's happening here? And we know that a lot of the people in this group actually did write a lot of poems and tracts and plays. Like, we don't have Oxford's plays. Surely Bacon wrote more poems and essays than the output we get, because all that stuff's mostly from late in his life. Like, where's all his early stuff? Clearly, like, yeah, we got some of Sidney, but even Sidney's stuff took a long time to come out, and it was like, oh no, don't print that, that's not supposed to be printed. And so it's like, where, what other stuff do we not have of Sidney's? And then, like, beyond that, like, we have so many plays that we just don't have our hands on that could have been written by either group or anybody, that we don't even know what it was about or what it's even called, but we know that they were there. So there's a whole host of issues here. It's an awkward division, not strictly accurate, but for now, this grouping will serve. For there are two distinct groups, and class identity is the most obvious means of distinguishing them. Within each of these groups, there are certain problems that affect most or all of the members of that group, problems different from those that affect the members of the other group. So the commoners group includes, in somewhat chronological order, and I don't think by any means this is an exhaustive list. This is just, I think, just a kind of a random bunch that we could list a whole bunch more. And the ones that we'll show will be the playwright names, but she's kind of got a mix of them here. George Gaskin, who's a poet and playwright, he's the earliest of the group. Then Edmund Spencer, who's supposedly, we know him as the great poet, but supposedly he maybe also wrote plays, because in a letter that Harvey writes, he mentions that Spencer had written 8 comedies before the year 1580. And so it's like, what the heck? And as crazy as that sounds, like, the one Spencer sonnet that we've included that we had in our Ren Fair video was all about theater, and that's the one that we still haven't made the video, but Taliesin, didn't get, he picked that one because he said, oh, it's got theater, it must be Shakespeare. George Peele, who is a poet and playwright. Thomas Kidd, who is a playwright. Marlowe, who is mainly a playwright but also has a few famous poems. Lilly, who's a playwright but might as well have been a poet. Maybe was also a poet. Robert Greene, poet, playwright. Watson, poet. Thomas Nash, pamphleteer, maybe a playwright as well. Gabriel Harvey, he was just a guy. Like, I still don't quite understand the Gabriel Harvey phenomenon.
He's just someone that argued with Nash and
someone
someone else, right?
He's a guy that's like super famous for like being this unbelievably smart dude that like writes these essays against Nash, and then like just gone from the scene until he dies like 40 years later.
Bizarre.
And yeah, like his brother is like one of the guys that's like figuring out how blood flow works and stuff, and like is buddies with Bacon, and maybe I got that wrong, but yeah, I don't know. But he also is like around and then just doesn't show up till he dies later.
Yeah.
So it's like, what's happening with this Harvey family? William Shakespeare, and moving forward a bit into the reign of James, Ben Jonson, John Webster. I don't know why she stops at these names, because there's like Thomas Dekker. Thomas Decker's crying out, saying, "Why did you not include me? Because I have no biography. All I want is biography, like, for Christmas." And like, yeah, John Ford. She said into the reign of James, like. John Ford. Like, we don't know much about John Ford, and the guy writes just like Shakespeare, except for his weird difference of pronouns. But like, otherwise, guy writes just like, or girl maybe. Okay, there are many more names in these. Okay, so, but these are the most prominent. Okay, I see. So she acknowledges there's many more names, but these are the ones that are prominent to her. I might have listed more than others. The court writers group is much smaller. It consists at the moment of 6 names. That's too small. That's wrong. Like, it should be a much larger. Like, she doesn't even have Thomas North on here. I guess McCarthy hadn't even still done his stuff. Like, she's writing this before the Neville theory and North theory are really even out and gaining ground. And so at least she said at the moment. So I guess at least 8 names. I would include more. But she says Philip Sidney, so shout out. Earl of Oxford, Sir Philip Sidney, Sir Francis Bacon, Lady Mary Sidney, and Sir Walter Raleigh. And I put, well, William Stanley, he's also been around for a while. Roger Manners, Henry Neville, Thomas North, let me see, Edward Dyer, let me see, I don't have more written down, but I can go off the top of my head, like, John Dee.
Francis Yates.
Yeah, Robert Dudley. So there's other names that we can consider as well. But notice she said Oxford first.
Do young Herberts ever get any credit for that?
Yeah, honestly, like, totally should. Like, especially since I threw John Ford's name in there. Let's throw William Herbert in there. Let's maybe throw Mary Roth in there, which is Mary Sidney's niece, Robert Sidney's daughter. Most of this group shows the same problem as William of Stratford: a pressing need to put bread on the table, troubles deriving from Catholic or otherwise problematic family background, an anomalous career pattern, no evidence of the kind of education required to support the erudition of the works that bear their names. Not all commoners have all these problems, but have at least two of them, and some have all of them. In any case, with everyone, there is seriously amiss with the record. What is most obviously true of all of them is that their biographies fail to support the aristocratic nature of the works. That is true of all but Marlowe. Marlowe is the classic case of the exception proving the rule, and I don't necessarily agree with her on that. I don't see Marlowe as any different than the rest of this crowd.
And Diana Price would have a word.
Yeah, yeah. Bastion will be in the comments after he hears this little soundbite. The court writers, although some in this group show some of the same problems as the commoners, anomalous career patterns, for instance. For all but one of the predominant problem is that their reputations as writers far exceed the evidence of their published works, leaving us and their biographers to assume that they wrote a good deal more than they published, or we should say than they published under their own names. And so that's definitely obviously true of Oxford, Raleigh, probably Sidney, probably Bacon, probably Mary Sidney for sure.
And we must note that, as with the commoners, this is true of all but one, in this case, Sir Philip Sidney, who died too young to have written much more than he published. I don't know why she thinks that exactly. And whose work would probably not have survived had he not assiduously promoted after his death by his sister in much the same way that, 200 years later, Mary Shelley promoted her dead husband, Percy Bysshe. Thus, each of these groups has their great exception. Sidney among the court writers, Marlowe among the commoners. Also, unlike the rest of his fellows, Marlowe shows evidence of, if not a presence at court, at least a genuine connection with the two leading court figures, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Strange, soon to be Earl of Derby. Unlike the other court writers, Sidney published only under his name, while unlike the other commoners, Marlowe gave a voice to the impulses and visions of his own class, not the aristocracy. Sidney and Marlowe shows us what we should expect to see in all writers of their groups, and that we do not need to see what we should see, and that we do not see what we should see. What the heck is this sentence? And what we do not see, what we should see must be the driving force behind our expanded inquiry.
And
sorry.
And I don't know that I even agree with her on that. That like Marlowe's must be a commoner because he has the voice of the common man. That
Francis Yates would authority. Have a word.
Yeah, like
Francis Yates would just have a word. He just a particular brand of authority. As we'll talk about maybe.
By no means is he the voice of the common man, and to think that all the proletariats, like these Marxist anti-authoritarians, like that's such a modernist take. And like to be fair, homegirl's coming up in the Cold War. Like Stephanie Hopkins Hughes is gonna be a little bit maybe leaning towards that middle American anti-communist sort of, so you can see that.
What's funny is that, and I'm not trying to just be our own sort of singular candidate sort of person, but it's just like, once again, she already has some kind of presumption that he could not have written more than what he, work and publish, and it's like, well,
we wouldn't even. You just said we wouldn't even know he published that. Yeah. But it's what's funny, and
this is my paranoia conspiracy brain, but it's just like, of all the people who does have their name published on it, to for sure know what type their style is per se or something like that, to know what sort of like, oh dang, like you can kind of, if you read some of Philip Sidney stuff, as we've been showing in the defense of Posey, and as well I think we'll get into some of the later stuff later on. It's flying with references. It's flying with Latin. It's flying with this and that. It's it's really showing like the biography behind what's on the page, and so you're able to actually connect the two. And like as you and I were sort of maybe sick of claiming, it's like, well, I think this is a Sidney style. This is Sidney style because like we actually have his name on it. We don't have to guess like, well, this must be Oxford, and so this is now the Oxfordian style, where it's like we have a little bit of his stuff, but not like, whole, I don't know, like some of this stuff is like super dense and crazy, like has anyone read this Arcadia thing or whatever, or the eclogues and whatnot? I don't know.
Well, like, I think clearly people aren't reading Sidney like they're reading Shakespeare. And like, as I said, like in an earlier video, we definitely read Sidney in undergrad, like, Spencer, Sidney, and Shakespeare are like musts in Renaissance literature, but like, you can just take a whole Shakespeare class and not have to read Sidney or Spencer. You only read Sidney and Spencer if you do a survey class. And so if you're doing a survey class, you get to read them. But if not, you're probably just reading Shakespeare. And maybe you'll get to touch Marlowe or Johnson in that class. Just to preface you the before and after. Like, here's the guy that made things to where Shakespeare could really take it to a height. And here's the guy that tried to follow up but couldn't. And that's sort of the pitch that you're given. And I don't particularly know that I agree with her saying that had he not been assiduously promoted after his death, that's that Dorothea Dickerman line, that everybody's just out there like rah-rahing Sidney, and that his sister's like the head promoter of it, but like the given narratives that like she said, no, don't publish this, and Samuel Daniel was like, here you go, printers, like. And then Samuel Daniel comes out and like, no, I didn't do it, but I'm sorry that it happened. And
it's like, is this not one of your poems in here?
Yeah.
How did that get in there?
Who put that in there? So yeah, I don't know that necessarily lines totally up, but I do like that she points out the Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley like analog to Philip and Mary. I think there's something to that. That said, I don't think I like Percy Bysshe all that much, so it's not perfect analog. But yeah, keep going, man.
Now let's look at some problems that affect not just one group, but the entire community. One such problem is that all, but Sidney and Marlowe, have anomalous career paths. That is, all have writing careers that fail to follow what we should consider to be the normal curve of activity for writers capable of rising to the high level of artistic effort that distinguishes the English Renaissance. A full examination of this problem will have to wait. A problem common to both groups that we can consider here is the peculiar fact that if we were to rely strictly on the record, these two groups of artists would seem to have no interaction with each other. In 1580, Edmund Spencer, a commoner, referred once or twice in letters he wrote to Gabriel Harvey, another commoner, to having associated with Sir Philip Sidney and Sir Edward Dyer, both court writers. As far as I recall, that's pretty much it for interrelations between the groups during the 40 years of the Elizabethan era. But then aren't there some connections specifically between Edmund and Leicester that I think we've talked about definitely in the D video and whatnot? And so, I know he was like in Ireland too, so maybe he must have, at least per the Spencer biographies, that he's in Ireland for a long time, and so that's where Sidney's dad is.
Of course, like, Stratfordians would be like, well, no, we know that Shakespeare is like best friends with Southampton. That's why he wrote all those poems to him. But like, what she would say is like, well, I'm talking about like things outside of dedications. I'm talking about letters. I'm talking about external biography outside the text. And we don't have anything that actually connects Southampton to Shakespeare. Like it doesn't totally line up or make sense.
It's inexplicable.
Which total sidetrack here, but going back to the George Wilkins thing, that Yorkshire tragedy, that play is about a dad that murders his kids because he's stuck married to the lady that he didn't want to marry. But like, what I never knew was that play is based on this guy William, maybe this is the character's name, William Calverley, but like he's married to this girl, and sorry, no, his real name's Brooke, but he's like the nephew of this guy Lord Cobham, but the chick that he kills, like, he's the cousin of Robert Cecil, the Cecils. Like, so it's like, wait, this play that's just about these random nobodies that are murdered are actually like the offshoot cousins.
Yeah, or literal relations or whatever.
Yeah,
people.
It's of the Cecils.
Yeah, how does that get out if it's that obvious about it, I guess?
And so, like, the play was heavily censored, which is why it's this warped version that we get. But, like, it's so weird that you think, oh, this is just some famous writer taking some random story, but sure enough, one of these guys that's an alternative candidate for this famous writer is cousins of the person that's being written about. And it's like, okay, wait a second, maybe there's more to that. Furthermore, it kind of mirrors what happens with Arden of Faversham. Arden of Faversham's about a chick killing her husband, not a guy killing his kids, but a chick killing her husband. The chick that killed her husband is the stepsister of Thomas North.
Okay.
But she's also like the great aunt or something of Shakespeare. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait, the sprawl.
Yeah.
So
I need to have that clip like on hand and ready to go. And like I know we're gonna have a sprawl episode exactly just to talk about this phenomenon, obviously. But
yeah, this phenomenon of these commoners seemingly distant from these there maybe are deeper connections, but it's not necessarily the connections that Stratfordians or mainstream Orthodox would be able to make heads or tails of. And I think it gets to dark, deep, sprawly places.
All right, continuing on with the essay. So separated are these two groups in their academic mind that the author of a recent and extremely valuable book on the Elizabethan courtier poets treats the commoners as if they didn't exist. By ignoring such works as the first edition of A Hundredth Sundry Flowers and the poems of Robert Greene, Stephen May is free to hand over the credit for all innovations in English versification during this period to Philip Sidney.
Shout out to Stephen May.
Yeah, exactly. Consider also how limited are the interactions that we know about even among the tiny community of genuine court writers, who not only must have known each other, but known each other well, and who, like all true artists, would certainly have been watching each other like hawks as they tried on one style after another. Apart from Philip and Mary Sidney, whose relationship is a given, all we have is the 1580 tennis court quarrel between Oxford and Sidney.
Which, hold on, like she's wrong there. That quarrel's 1576, if I'm correct. But continue.
We can guess that their literary rivalry had something to do with this power play, but where's the evidence? Both innovative poets, both considered at one time or another to be the best at court. The two were at court together from at least 74 on. They were also both at the Cecil household during Christmas holidays of 1568, when Sidney was 15 and Oxford was 18.
She's also wrong on that there. Sidney would be 14.
Bacon joined them at court in 1579 at the age of 18, when Oxford was 29 and Sidney was 25. And, I wonder what she has to think about.
Bacon also would not have been 18 then. Sorry, her math's like not good here. Like,
I wonder what she would have to say about this. This in of itself. I wonder how she questions like Fulk Greville is the only still sort of like part of this evidence that she doesn't like to sort of like verify a lot of this stuff, right? Because this tennis match is a Fulk Greville line, and we've sort of already talked about at length in some of the other videos about how that's sort of like kind of strange and itself later on.
Possibly suspect.
Okay. Raleigh came aboard in 1582 when he was 30, Oxford was 32, Sidney 28, and Bacon 21. The following year, when Raleigh helped Oxford get back into the Queen's graces after his 2-year banishment from court, Raleigh's reference to Aesop's tale of the ungrateful snake that bit his rescuer may refer to Oxford's possible tendency to lampoon his rivals on stage, or it may not. In 1588, when Mary Sidney came to court to take her dead brother's place as a voice for her family interests, for the Protestant cause, and as a leading patron of the arts, she and Bacon were 27, Raleigh was 36, and Oxford was 38. Are we to assume that these 5 young writers, all burdened with excessive leisure, all burning with Renaissance ambition and bursting with talent, had nothing to do with each other beyond a single argument on a tennis court or an aspersion lightly cast in a letter?
Why is her math so bad? Sorry. Mary Sidney would not have been 27 in 1588. She's born in 63.
She has, she only mentioned the letter, about the tennis court match, but what about, Sidney and de Vere at odds with the marriage proposal of Elizabeth to Duke de
Alençon.
Alençon, there we go.
Alençon.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, yeah.
Close enough.
Yeah.
But point still that, that's just another one of these. I think there seem to be. I'm not sure if there's direct reference to maybe not to each other, but definitely at least to the same scenario. So maybe I'm wrong on Philip Sidney's Elizabeth. Yeah, don't listen to de Vere. He's a dork.
Yeah, I need.
And
to
de Vere's don't listen to Sidney. He's wet behind the ears. Whatever it is. I forget if they call each other out exactly.
Yeah, we need to check out those letters. That's a good question.
The only evidence of a connection between Oxford and Bacon is a single mention by Oxford of his cousin Bacon and a 1595 business letter to Robert Cecil, while many years later Bacon passed on an unsubstantiated rumor about the 13th Earl of Oxford in his History of Henry VII. There's also the rumor handed down by the 17th century gossip monger John Aubrey that early in the reign of James, Mary Sidney went to Wilton, by then her son's estate, to beg the king for Raleigh's life. But to what extent should we be trusting Aubrey's testimony? All? None? Some? And if some, where do we draw the line? We're not better much off with interactions among members of the commoners group. Apart from a number of dedications to each other and their published works, we only know that in 1592, Marlowe and Watson got into a brawl at Hog Lane.
Her dates are wrong there. It's 1590.
Near the Bishopsgate Theatre, in which a third man was killed, and that Kidd and Marlowe once shared a room. Marlowe and Matthew Royden have been frequently mentioned by historians as members of Raleigh's School of Night, but where's the evidence?
Yeah, she's right there.
And then there are the various comments made by Johnson about Shakespeare, such as that he, quote, he wrote so much that he should have been stopped. I wonder if Baconian's Hog Lane.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. And there's numerous comments from Johnson about these other writers, and we get comments from Haywood about these other writers, but those comments don't necessarily prove the identity. They just prove that there's a hand using that name. Whether that name is actually the person behind it or not, that's, I think, what's up for question. And so she makes a good point here. The community of writers in Shakespeare's time was small, very small. Compared with ours today, it's tiny. There were only a handful of printers who could publish their works, all located in London, a handful of booksellers who could sell their wares, and that only in Paul's Churchyard. Writers, publishers, printers, and patrons would all have been well known to each other. The small size of their community makes that a certainty. But where's the evidence? We don't have a bunch of documents showing any of this. The history of art should assure us that all such art communities gather together as a matter of shared instinct. Most innovative artists are drawn to each other by common passion. For an artist, there's no audience like other artists. And so she goes on comparing Picasso, Matisse, saying Sidney's writing Arcadia for his sister. But some of these famous poems and works, even plays, why are they written? And yeah, some of these are obviously written for a commercial venture at some point, but some of the earliest ones that are just being done for private showings and aristocratic houses, who's putting these pins down and penning these plays for the first time, and why?
I think you should read this bottom footnote, and this is what I was referring to, because she says that she was like, where's the proof, and so she's going to clarify what what that proof
Okay.
means, because
Yeah.
this is where the Stratfordians are like, well, no, here's the obvious proof that they tell us is what it is, right? But then here's just sort of saying, like, it's like kind of like your first basis of beginning to prove something, like, okay, that's like the first step, but then once you start to compare it and, like, you know, weigh up all your evidence or all these proofs, it's like, wait a second, they're like disproving each other, or they're sort of like questioning one another.
In contradiction.
And so she says, I want to make it clear that when I say there's no proof of a particular thing, I mean there's no evidence of the sort that comes from 16th century sources outside the realm of literature, from things like unpublished letters, journals, diaries, letterbook entries, holograph marginalia, and privately owned books, entries in the stationer's register, and in parish records and the like. Because of the problems I'm about to outline, I'm purposely not giving evidentiary weight to anything that was obviously, or even possibly, written for publication. Not that poetry, romance, tales, and plays are lacking in important evidence, quite the contrary. But we must begin with the non-literary evidence, because we need to know, first, how much of it there actually is, second, what kinds of non-literary evidence we have, and perhaps most important, what kinds of non-literary evidence seems to be unreasonably short supply. Literary historians tend to lump the two sources of information together, that deriving from the writers themselves, plus their publishers and printers, and that deriving from outside sources, private letters, etc. For purposes of a comparison, we must begin separating these. But I'll take it a step further and be like, you know, is it just a oopsie daisy, you know, gee gollies, like, these are the particulars we do have about these certain things? Like,
Right.
Why do we only get, you know, one little mention from Folk Greville about the Oxford Sidney thing or whatever, right?
Right.
Although I do like in a bunch of the other biographies around the Sidney, they're like, oh yeah, Sidney's learning all this crazy stuff with D and doing all this other stuff. And so when we talk about trying to properly, like, put some of the biography behind the writer, it's just like, I don't know, I just find it kind of glaring sometimes.
Yeah.
But, I digress. Next paragraph, she says, during the 1950s in America, writers Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg, later to be labeled the Beat Generation, all as yet unpublished, were drawn thousands of miles to find each other. Much of the history of this group consists of trips taken back and forth across the country together and to see each other. During another supernova of English literature, we know that Keats was to Shelley what Shelley was to Byron, what Wordsworth was to Coleridge. We know that Byron was to Goethe, and to several generations of budding writers from Tennyson to Carlyle to Walt Whitman. We know that Carlyle was to John Stuart Mill, what Whitman was to Emerson, what Sylvia Plath was to Ted Hughes, and so forth, throughout the entire history of innovative art. And just to kind of hit on, like, the episode 1 of the Philip Sidney's Defense of Poetry, it was almost like, you know, reading some of this Thomas Pynchon stuff and then backtracking to, like, Oakley Hall, and then, like we said, to Bierce and to Chambers and to, you know, Twain and then Bret Hart and all those other guys, right? And so we're the literary lineage for what you will, right? Legacy, right? And so I just like this sort of call out here, but it's like, you know, just kind of giving it lip service, but, you know, it's like, I don't know, like we've experienced it or something.
With the court writers, it is their works that are hidden. With the commoners, it is their biographies that are hidden, or at least anything that might connect them to the world of playwrights and audiences and novelists and readers. Why, if we found anything, has it been only the most banal notice of baptisms, marriages, deaths of wives and children, or for a family connection with some kind of business, unrelated in most cases to anything literary or theatrical.
Thomas Dekker episode.
Yeah. And, like, some of these people, yeah, sure, they're people, but, like, why isn't there, like, nobody in the family wrote down anywhere that, like, yeah, my son or my brother, my husband's the most famous dramatic writer of the time? Like, okay. That so many of these commoners have this problem suggests such connections have not been lost, that in fact they do not and never did exist. Were only one or even two out of a large group of writers whom we had sufficient evidence of their actual functions as writers, as is the case in the early 17th century, we might shrug it off. But there are at least 6 of these Elizabethan commoners that I can think right off the top of my head for whom we have no absolute proof that they ever wrote anything. Spencer, Petty, Green, Nash, Shakespeare, Webster. The writing community of mid to late 16th century England is by no means large enough to sustain so many anomalies of this nature. Certainly facts have been suppressed, there can be no other explanation. these writers knew each other. So she is something of a conspiracy theorist in this sense. Like, she's saying there is an agenda in keeping these silenced and suppressed, that there's an active force doing this. It's not just some chaotic thing lost to time.
Do you think she's like a anonymous plot, sort of Cecil, big bad guy doing it all? Whatever?
Yeah, that's definitely where she's going to go with it. Maybe not in this essay, but...
nope, maybe keep reading.
Okay. But the suppression of their connections with each other has to be something voluntary, something that goes beyond the possibility of a systematic eradication of records by some third party. No one, not even the Queen or the Cecils, had the power required to eliminate records on this scale. There may very well have been some eradication of records, but it can't explain the volume of this thundering silence. So these are just four biographies that she's picked out that seem especially anomalous to her, but by no means are the only ones, and I would have probably picked different ones.
Although, yeah, well, maybe we can still point out some of the contradictions, or some of our, Sidney ironies, and the ones she picked, maybe.
Robert Greene, author of 37 pamphlets written between 81 and 92, was an innovative writer whose popularity sparked the evolution of the pamphlet, the first ever English periodical. Yet, although Greene had the longest documented career of any Elizabethan writer, over a decade, years of research by his biographers failed to turn up any solid evidence of his existence, until his name was discovered in the Earl of Leicester's household account book as having received payment for a Greene pamphlet. Until this discovery, we had nothing that connected any one of the many Robert Greenes listed in various parish and university records with the production of these popular periodicals. Yet, even this does nothing to quell our suspicions that he was not their true author, suspicions based on the fact that Greene's favorite themes reflect an aristocratic upbringing rather than that of Yorkshire Cordwainer or the Norwich Saddler that hopeful biographers have dug from the records. You can keep going.
Not that Greene lacks a biography, on the contrary. Greene's problem is he has too much biography. No author of the period has a fully developed an image as does Robert Greene. Unfortunately, it was provided entirely by Greene himself, with flourishes added by fellow pamphleteers Nash and Harvey. Although he and they claim that he was well known to his readers, no corroboration from a non-literary source has ever been located. The suspicion remains that the writer, as he is described in these pamphlets, is as fictional as everything else by Greene. His biographers know perfectly well that neither he nor his fellow pamphleteers are to be trusted, yet they continue to repeat his self-portrait. Why? Because the page must be filled, and they have nothing more substantial to offer. Greene's style, fluid, easy, rich in Shakespearean tropes and metaphors, was, according to the current wisdom, the model for the soon-to-be popular bard, who, according to the academics, kicked off his illustrious career by plagiarizing poor impoverished Robert Greene. Greene's death, as described in his supposedly final pamphlet, while entertaining, is ridiculous as an account of a real death, which may say something about the generations of academics who have, and continue, to swallow it whole.
Yeah, he died from drinking too much wine, too much fish. That'll kill a man, I guess.
Thomas Nash. Shout out Thomas Decker Nash. Odin video. Pamphleteer is equally innovative, equally entertaining, and equally suspect. Thank you. Like Greene, Nash seems to be a purely literary being. Born fully formed, like Athena from the forehead of Zeus, he appears to have been gestated by the Martin Marplot pamphlet war of the late 1580s. Unlike Greene, however, who appears only once as a name in a household record, biographers have managed to find it slightly more as substantial as Thomas Nash. The son of provincial vicar?
Vicar. Yeah, vicar.
What's a vicar? I didn't look it up.
Some kind of religious thing. It's like, you got bishops and then you got...
Okay. The real Nash earned his B.A. at St. John's by washing dishes and peeling turnips, hardly sufficient to explain either the depth of his erudition. He was, apart from Francis Bacon, the most obviously learned writer of his generation, or his sheer gall, astounding in a society where a libel suit could cause a man to lose an ear or a hand. How on earth did this humble vicar's son manage to escape in real form a reprisal while continuing to produce one merciless satire after another?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. It's like, it's not just that it's a vicar's son. That it's the most biting satirist, and like in the history of the English language, and that's some humble vicar's son. Which, yeah, check out our Nash Decker video. We show that Nash, or we don't. We show that Donna Murphy shows that Nash is very likely Thomas Dekker. They're one and the same. Nash disappears right when Dekker pops on the scene. Dekker has no biography whatsoever, and that like Nash has so very little. It seems to me that one pen name turned to another when that pen name got too hot.
Edmund Spencer, another one of our favorites here, whose Fairy Queen was the great court entertainment of his generation, is credited with the second influential style development since Chaucer, Lilly's euphemism being the first. The real Spencer is a shadowy figure who got his degree at Cambridge by means of a scholarship for poor boys. Following a few years, quote, in obscurity, he sailed for Ireland at age 28 as secretary to Lord Grey. Oh, well. After 2 decades in Ireland, where his life would surely have resembled that of the early English settlers in America, Spencer finally returned to England. When he staked his claim, was burned to the ground by angry natives. Despite the baroque nature of the Fairy Queen, based on the kind of Greek romances and Arthurian-type legends that the court community had enjoyed for centuries, and the obvious of the opaque references to court gossip of his prose work, there is no record that he was ever so much as introduced at court. Why would a poet of Spencer's stature, one who produced a canon far greater in size than either his fellow commoners or the court poets, one whose books were obviously aimed at a court audience, why would such a one not be absorbed into the court community by means of a small sinecure, so that he could continue to entertain his primary audience, the nobility, close at hand, as would have been the case had he been born in France or Italy? Why instead was he allowed to suffer the slings and arrows of the angry Irish for 20 years until they finally drove him back to England, where, at the age of 47, he died a pauper's death within weeks of his arrival?
Yeah, Spencer's like super red flag. Doesn't make any sense to me. His life story doesn't add up.
But yeah,
he's like known as like the original laureate of England, yet he dies a poor nobody. How? Why?
And as we definitely showed in some of the John Dee video, that Spencer is definitely aimed at and referencing a bunch of the court people and the court themselves, and it's definitely all built around Elizabeth's image. And Francis Yates would definitely, I think, question like, there has to be much closer connection and sort of like, for as big of a ambition of what the project of the Fairy Queen is, I think, set out to do. Yeah, it's inexplicable about like, he writes this kind of like great huge tract about this whole sort of like,
giant courtly allegory.
Yeah, and it's very much the westward. It's kind of a manifest destiny, but for a burgeoning British Empire going on or whatever, right? And so, it'd be like, as if the guy who wrote, the Star Spangled Banner or whatever was like, probably like a nobody. I don't know if that's probably a bad comparison. Once again, we've questioned Edmund Spencer, and we would definitely agree with her on this point. But as far as like once again, just the irony of like who he is known to hang out with is definitely Leicester, and as we showed in that King Arthur book in the John Dee video, it's like every time they mention Edward Spencer, they always had to follow up with Sidney or vice versa, right? And there was a constant comparison between the two, and people definitely going, well, he must have hung out with Spencer must have hung out with Sidney during that little 2-period gap that they, or 1-period gap that Sidney's back at home.
They must have crossed paths.
Yeah.
Best month of his life. We could read Lily, but let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and read Lily, because Lily.
Oh, okay.
Lily's a weird one.
Wait, before we go on to Lily, let me ask you this: because I'm not as well versed in the SAC question. But so she's definitely Stephanie Hopkins Hughes. You said is an Oxfordian.
Yep.
She's definitely questioning Edmund Spencer. Who does she think Oxford is Edmund Spencer? Or who does she think is Edmund Spencer then? Does she
Bacon.
think? Oh, she thinks Bacon's Edmund Spencer.
Bacon's
Okay,
Spencer.
okay.
And she thinks that Oxford is E.K., who is like an amender or editor to one of Spencer's poems. I think it's the Shepherd's Calendar. And so, like I told you, Spencer has this one poem that has like these kind of funny, non-ergodic footnotes to the poem that like are almost a satirical undercutting of
Really?
the poem. Yeah.
What?
And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and
what
it's,
the heck?
it's by someone named E.K., and nobody knows who E.K. is. But she thinks that de Vere is E.K.
He's doing a Nabokov before, like, or type thing or whatever.
Yep.
Oh my god.
Yeah, which Shepherd's Calendar is like all sorts of and
Yeah.
that has all these pastoral nicknames of all these aristocratic and literary figures, and that, like, yeah, it seems to me if we could just decode some of the Spencer, we might be able to make heads or tails of this expanded authorship question. And so I think she's definitely on the right track by saying, like, look, expanded authorship question, it comes from, for her, like, Robert Greene, Edmund Spencer more than, and Shakespeare probably more than anybody. For us, maybe it's more Decker and Daniel and Drayton, the Triple D team. Triple D, there you go.
Oh.
Yeah. But, like, she's totally right. And, like, as we said in several of our last videos, like, please, can we start looking into Spencer? And I guess we'll have to start doing it. But, like, yeah, Spencerian scholars and Shakespearean scholars are, like, just in these two separate worlds not talking to each other. And, like, that sort of goes with what I'm saying about undergrad classes. You touch Shakespeare, you don't touch Spencer, you know? And, like, if we could just connect these two worlds, like, this expanded authorship thing might open up. But, yeah, going into John Lilly, because John Lilly's, like, all these other characters, they're, like, big in the 80s, and then they just freaking die in the 90s, right? Like, just the worst kind of, the 60s are over, baby.
Yeah.
Like, 70s are here. Like, Hendrix is dead, you know?
Yeah, man, doing too much fish and wine, or
Yeah, dude. Like, oh man, shooting up the fish and, you know, smoking the wine. Like, it's definitely the same kind of rock star narrative that we get that comes out of the death of the 60s, right? And so it's like, every one of them just about. Marlowe, dead. Kidd, dead. Green, dead. Peele, dead. Watson, dead. Like, who's left? What other university wit name is there? Nash disappears, then dead. Even Spencer, like, it's later in the 90s, but dead before the 90s are over. Like, what happened to this 80s crowd? Like, well, Lilly's the only one that makes it through the 90s. But here's the thing. Lilly backs out of the scene. Lilly's not writing in any of the 90s. Lilly's the biggest thing on the planet.
Isn't there another guy who does the same thing? Was it Marston or somebody else that they wrote something and then just, like, went off and became like a bishop or something?
Yep.
I forget who.
Marston does that about a decade or two later, and Lilly does quit to go work for the Queen or the church or something. I wish I remembered better. But yeah, like, he's like the progenitor of an entire new type of literature, this whole new style. Nobody's developed a new style or form of literature since Chaucer, and he develops this thing called euphuism, which is like being overly ornate and poetical, using a lot of like paradox and antithesis and like conceits, or, you know, the early versions of conceits, and like you know, stuff that turns into Shakespeare once it's a little more refined and streamlined. And people say that a lot of stuff moves away from euphuism, but you can still see all the traces of euphuism, even though, like, the 80s stuff that Lilly does and some of the other guys that I mentioned that followed the euphuism, which Oxford's supposed to be totally in that crowd too, their stuff's like so much about the beauty of it that the plot is like secondary. Characters are secondary. It's all about just this overly lush form of lyrical kind of stating of things. And so every character speaks for like a page. Like, you know, every character speaking in monologues just about to the other character. And it's not always fun to read, but like Sometimes they'll wax philosophical a little bit too, but like it's very much about these kind of sonnet like courtly, love drama kind of things. Why is Lily like just the biggest thing in the world in the 80s, putting out Endymion, stuff like that? He's like the first novelist in English, argued. And then it's not like he got hurt or sick or just not going to write anymore. And when exactly that happens or why is like, I don't know. Maybe I need to do more Lily research, but so she'll probably go into some of that. So John Lilly, who may or may not have been the grandson of the famous grammarian, had a degree from Magdalen College, Oxford, afterwards working for Lord Burleigh, then for Burleigh's son-in-law, Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Although Lilly is credited with 2 immensely popular novels and with being the first real English novelist and with creating the most innovative and popular prose style since Chaucer, and with 7 plays that entertained the court throughout the 1580s, why, after losing his post at court in 1590 at the age of 36, it's not like he's old. People act like, oh, Lilly was old and he retired. 36, did he never, for the 16 years left to him, publish another word? So, yeah, even though he didn't die in the 90s, disappeared from 90 onwards. But what is going on with this guy? Why did this popular writer, despite the fact that he seems to have been in the great need of paying work, cease to write? So yeah, this guy that's broken doesn't have a job. Like, maybe he could go and write since he's incredibly capable at that, and that this burgeoning commercial enterprise is popping up out of the scene. Nope. All of the commoners groups show similar problems. You may ask why it has taken so long to realize that these writers share the same kinds of authorship problems until now. Most readers rarely read enough by or about one of these authors for such questions to arise. Yeah. And I think we get at that in our earlier episode with the essential readings, that like, guys, you got to go and read a bunch of these non-Shakespeare plays to try and get a handle on the whole conversation. And that as soon as you read all these other non-Shakespeare plays, you want to go learn about the writer just like you want to learn about Shakespeare. And kind of like Shakespeare, you don't get the answers you're looking for. Unfortunately, those with no time for this sort of in-depth studies required must depend upon academics who have chosen it as their life work. Unfortunately, since university training nowadays is highly specialized, academics themselves often don't read widely enough to see the extent of the problem. We alluded to that with the Spencer, scholars versus the Shakespeare scholars. Those with no time for, they tend to focus either on Shakespeare or on one of the other writers, such as Sidney, Johnson, or Marlowe, or Spencer, or they may concentrate on a group, such as the university wits or the courtier poets. Although they are certainly aware of the anomalies in their own subject area, they may assume that their chap is the only one with problems. Read the biography of any one of these writers, and if their biographer is honest, you will find that he or she is well aware of the anomalies peculiar to that writer, but when they're asked to write for the encyclopedias or introduce a new edition of the plays, they tend to smooth out the rough patches. They gotta sell their guy, and yeah, especially if you're going up against Shakespeare and you're a scholar of one of these other people, you're not gonna go and start calling your guy into question. You need to legitimize your guy as much as possible to try and get it up against, Shakespeare, to try and get your stuff into the journals, try and get your stuff funded, try and get your course taught at the university versus, the other course. Not a lot of people are getting to specialize in Samuel Daniel or Thomas Dekker, Why confuse the ordinary reader? No expert will willingly display his or her confusion over some problem within their domain before an ignorant and unforgiving world. Shakespeare scholars are certainly aware of the authorship question, but they don't want to open it for discussion. Mostly because their primary interest, I might say their sole interest, is the text. Problems of provenance are no more than annoying distractions, so they continue to cling to names on title pages, refusing to take the question much further. As for those who focus on the writers of the period, they simply accept what the Shakespeare scholars choose to tell them about the Great One. Should questions arise, they trust their colleagues to be telling them the truth, and in any case do not want to make trouble, since Shakespeare Studies represents an elite club, the cream of the humanities division. Even problems arising from the text, such as why it is one occasionally hears exactly the same phrasing in Shakespeare as in Marlowe, or in Shakespeare as in Robert Greene, or in Robert Greene as in Lilly, though they may be noted in passing, are usually brushed aside in discussion because any comment quickly leads to questions of who wrote what when, and whether these guys knew each other, questions for which no one can give them an answer, and oops, here we are at that darned authorship question again. Run away. So, here's her expanded thesis. She says, let's not run away, let's come up with a workable thesis that we can all embrace. First, let's consider how small the English writing community was at that time. Far too small for these two groups, the commoners and the courtly writers, to be as separate, in fact, as they appear from the records and the narrative that we've built from these records. Let us also consider the nature of the works in question, most of which are based on the kind of plots and themes long favored by the nobility, themes of no great interest to the intermediate classes, who would have known the countryside well enough to be bored by the kind of artificial pastoral fantasies that please their so-called betters. Which I think is what we're talking about with stuff like the Fairy Queen. Surely there's enough, fantasy and romance in it for commoners to get into, but the actual, philosophical and structural underpinnings to the Fairy Queen are very much, rooted in upholding monarchy and aristocratic values and Greek ideas that, I don't know how many common English folk are going to be open to all these kind of weird Greek poetic and dramatic and philosophical concepts and mythology, and it might be a little off-putting to them. So let us, in addition, consider the quality of the works in question, many of them huge watersheds in the development of our language and our literature, English literature. Let us also consider the relentless drive a group of genuinely gifted writers feels to connect to with as wide an audience as possible, a drive felt by all genuine writers, one comparable to that of a thirsty desert traveler in search of water. So, these are people that desperately want to write. These are people that are writing incredibly powerful works that have a lot of themes and ideas that favor and uphold nobility and aristocracy, and that at some point the crowd of people doing this has to be a somewhat tight-knit crowd. It's kind of the dawn of the whole scene. There can't be that many. Thus, matching the need of the authentic court writers to publish the equally pressing need of the commoners to survive during the uncertain economy of the mid-16th century, bingo, we end up with the same scenario for the entire Elizabethan writing community that we have for the poet Shakespeare and his stand-in, the Stratford entrepreneur with the remarkably punnable name. Here then is the expanded form of the authorship thesis that I wish to present. It is actually already well established, the only difference between the new and the old being the addition of a few dozen names. The old authorship thesis goes something like this. The works of Shakespeare were written by the Earl of Oxford or Bacon or Marlowe or whoever, and due to his desire for privacy or security, were published under a pen name derived from the real name of the financially needy William Shakespeare Stratford. The new and expanded thesis might go something like this. The English Renaissance was created by a small group of highly educated, talented writers who, for the most part, like their European counterparts, were born into court society and who bypassed the social constraints of their class and the religious and political constraints of their times by publishing over the names of commoners who lent or sold them the use of their names in exchange for cash, patronage, or other benefits. So I think that kind of sums up maybe our stance very generally perfectly.
Yeah.
We have a whole host of people in power or connected to power that have the time, desire, and need to write, and it's not just out of fun or diversion. It's for specific, maybe propagandic purposes, sort of psychological operation kind of thing, espionage purposes. And the propaganda doesn't always have to be top down to the proletariat. That the propaganda can be working within the aristocracy against and for each other, But yeah, this is these kind of people writing it, and it's not the names that we get. The names that we get must be some kind of frontmen that surely are going to be connected somehow. Like once again, we showed Shakespeare is the great nephew or something of Alice Arden, who is the stepsister of Thomas North. So there are connections, like, surely. And there's got to be, if these people are frontmen, you got to somewhat trust your frontmen, right? So, like, I don't think any of that's out of the question. Let me see. Let's go further. Although this subterfuge operated on a fairly broad scale at the beginning, it continued in full force for a relatively brief period of time, beginning at some point as early as the 1560s, and I think she's totally right in saying this, and gradually diminishing in the 17th century as the commercial stage and press became sufficiently lucrative that members of the entrepreneurial classes who had no need to hide their identities began to earn their living as writers. And so it gradually transfers to the middle class as it becomes popular enough to where you can write stuff without all this crazy education, that maybe some of that crazy education is more accessible, and like maybe that's happening gradually even within the Elizabethan and Jacobean era to some extent. Maybe not every one of these writers is an aristocratic writer. And maybe some of these people are able to come up into a circle that's aristocratic, but surely this is predominantly an aristocratic circle in this Shakespeare era. And so I think that makes sense. And, it's also possible that, like, maybe some other stuff after Shakespeare maybe needs to be relooked at. Maybe that's a crazy thing. We don't have to be skeptical of every piece of literature in history, but, like, there may be some other things that maybe could lend itself to that since Shakespeare somewhere in the world. Even so, for a variety of reasons, publishing under pseudonyms would continue well into the 19th century. And still does today. It didn't stop. It was not just Shakespeare the poet who used to stand in to publish during the Elizabethan era, but all the court writers. That is, all but Sidney. And once again, if Sidney's alive, probably uses a pen name as well. So, just saying, which we think he may be alive and may be using a pen name. But, like, yeah, she's acting like Sidney's the super anomaly, and I guess technically he is, but, like, it's not Sidney that's like, yeah, publish it under my name, because presumably he's dead, And if he's not dead, then, like, he can still publish it under his name because he's supposed to be dead, right? And if we feel squeamish about taking the glory from commoners, Green, Nash, Watson, etc., let us not forget Marlowe, the genuine working-class genius, shout out to Bastion, who was in some ways greater than all the court writers. That is all but one. I have so many things that I would like to say about that, but I'll just save it for a future video. At some point, we're going to have to go through some of the Marlowe canon, because, like, fun fact, like, almost none of Marlowe's plays were printed with his name on the page when they're first printed. The styles in Marlowe's plays don't all match up. We don't know the dating of the plays. We don't know exactly who or why they're written or where they're being performed in the first place in some occasions. So, like, yeah, the whole Marlowe thing, we act like that thing's all sealed up and we know exactly who Marlowe is. And, like, surely there's some guy named Marlowe, but, like, why he's the guy writing the plays, I think that's up for debate. I've seen Marlovians point to stuff that says, oh, this must be biography that only Marlowe would know, but most of the stuff that I've seen them point to just points to it's somebody that's from Kent. And so if any of our other aristocratic writers have knowledge of Kent, then, like, I don't think you necessarily need a Marlowe. Same way that Stratfordians, like, look at all this Stratford knowledge, it has to be Shakespeare, and it's like, well, no, Fulk Greville knows all about Stratford, and Michael Drayton, whoever Michael Drayton is, also knows all about all that Warwickshire stuff, too. So it's like, that's a little bit of a misnomer, and so I wonder if that happens with Marlowe. I do need to brush up on more Marlowe stuff, but I'm kind of a Marlowe authorship questioner as well. And I know a lot of Baconians out there, like, yeah, Marlowe's not the guy. Like, don't like, it's our guy. Our guy Bacon wrote it. Which I think to some degree is true, right? I guess we haven't talked too much about that, but we will at some point.
We kind of hinted at it in the Nash, Decker, Marlowe video. Yeah. Was it Price who talks about, I think one of hers was like the Nash, Decker, Bacon continuum or whatever.
Yeah, right? Murphy,
okay.
Yeah. Which I don't think she says Bacon. I think she's a Marlovian, but I know Hopkins Hughes thinks that Bacon has something to do with Nash, and so if Bacon's Nash, then he must be Decker, etc. Problem solved. Although admittedly this scenario raises new problems, let's see what problems it solves right off the bat. First, returns the Renaissance to its expected source, the court community, which, as with every other European nation, was the only group with enough education and leisure to devote the time and mind-consuming business of creating vernacular literature of the imagination. Second, Shakespeare is no longer a weird anomaly, but simply one of a number of similar writers' stand-in combinations. Third, it helps to explain why authors like Greene, Nash, Watson, Webster are so lacking in biographical particulars, why they sow such peculiar career paths, and how it is that at the end of their careers, rather than be accorded real funerals, notices in parishes, burial records, they kind of vanish. It explains why court writers like the Earl of Oxford and Mary Sidney lack enough published works to support their reputations. It explains why so many of the early greats of the English Renaissance, unlike their European counterparts, never appeared at court. It helps to explain some strange coincidences, such as the fact that two most anomalous writers of their time, Greene and Watson, supposedly died within days of each other, or how the development of euphuism seems to migrate from one writer to another, as it leaves one appearing in another, like a thieving servant who goes from one master to another, leaving a trail of paltry thefts behind. A little prolix on that sentence. But it may, in time, also help to explain a number of other problems, such as, why is there no juvenilia for Shakespeare, or, honestly, almost any of these poets or playwrights, who, like Nash, appears to emerge fully developed at the age of 25. Which, yeah, like, that's my big question for all these people that are like, oh, Drayton and Decker, they started writing plays in 1597, because we see it in Henslow's diary. It's like, okay, so these guys are, like, either, in the case of Drayton, just some random poet guy, or in the case of Decker, an absolute nobody who's never done anything. All of a sudden, they're able to come be the front runners for your giant commercial play venture that you sunk, the equivalent of millions of dollars into, to build up a theater for. Like, you're just gonna go out the door, like, can anybody write plays? You, what's your name? Thomas Decker? Sounds good enough. Come on in, write a play. Like, and then all of a sudden is the main playwright of that whole enterprise. No, garbage, nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Why, similarly, are there no early works for brilliant, energetic Francis Bacon, whose long and impressive writing career seemingly commenced only in his mid-30s, despite his obvious boredom at having nothing important to do throughout his 20s and early 30s? Why, conversely, John Lilly, after a blazing literary trail with his euphuist novels in his late 20s, fell silent just as he was reaching the apex of his career in his late 30s, and despite his apparent need for work and money as expressed in his letters, begging the crown for a job, seems never to have published another thing for the remaining 18 years of his life. How Thomas Kidd managed to write one smash hit play when everything published under his name was mediocre to poor, and why his one great success was never published under his name. I think Brady and I have already kind of covered that with our Henslow video. Like, yeah, the good stuff in Kidd isn't Kidd, it's Johnson. Like, when Hieronymo's getting reworked and Richard Crookback's getting reworked, the Johnson writer, whoever that be, that's the one putting the good stuff in Kidd. Otherwise, Thomas Kidd is probably something we would call a more minor or early writer. But I think that we still need to solve that authorship. How George Gascon managed to write in a single year 2 plays that permanently raised the artistic level of English dramaturgy, then settled into a dull style that would have ensured his obscurity were it not for these 2 plays. Yeah, so this guy George Gascon sets the whole tone of writing plays, and then never writes anything worthwhile after that. Who wrote Green's Groatsworth and why? Who was Shakespeare and who wrote the posthumous Green pamphlets and why? I can answer that. That's Henry Chettle. Henry Chettle is probably the same person as Robert Greene. I think that's what she's getting at. But like, yeah, like that's the answer to that one. What was the real cause of the Nash-Harvey pamphlet war? That's a beautiful question. I think one for me that's as big or more is the War of the Theaters. What is happening between Marston, Dekker, and Johnson, and supposedly Shakespeare as well, maybe as much as Middleton and Chapman as well. Like, what's this whole sort of literary feud that's building between these big-time authors that seem to be collaborating in different combinations with each other? So, what's happening? Webster as well. Excuse me. And, you know, scores of so far equally intractable problems. The presence of Daniel and Shakespeare. It's another one that comes off the top of my head. So many others. Let's see. Expanded theory of authorship does not, probably never will, answer every single question, but it does offer solutions to some most perplexing. And I think, I'm gonna paraphrase for the end here. I think more than anything, it gives us a framework to ask questions, to sort of help us build a language for being skeptical about authorship and what we know and how we claim authorship. Maybe not just for this period, but in general. Like, now that, you know, modernity has gotten all of our amounts of learning to such a high scientific standard, like, should we not try and apply that on the stuff that we know and love and read? And I think we start with Shakespeare because Shakespeare's the biggest thing, but like we work from there. Yeah, if you pull up the chart here, we can real quickly show. And I kind of messed up this PDF, so just scroll till you see. Okay, so I have a chart here, and we've seen this chart before in our Henslow episode and our Sir Thomas More episode, but I updated it to where we only have dramatic names, only playwrights on here. People on here also do other things other than playwriting, but I didn't have any names that were specifically only poets on here. I wanted to take them off. And like I said also, I didn't add George Wilkins because I don't think George Wilkins wrote a darn thing in any play. But as we see here, we got a bunch of names. And they're all writing in the same sort of general time frame as Shakespeare. So we can see their timelines. A lot of them we don't even know when they're born, or some of them we don't know when they die, despite the fact that they're somewhat well-known playwrights. Some of these aren't totally well-known. Like, some of you folks out there may not know who the heck Wentworth Smith is, or William Houghton, or Richard Hathaway, but they wrote a big number of plays for Henslow. You know, equal amounts as some of these other big names that we do kind of know, or bigger names that we do know, like Haywood or Webster. And that, you know, as we saw in our other video, that almost all these in the same time frame as Shakespeare are Henslow playwrights. Shakespeare seems to be the only one that's alive from the era that's not a Henslow playwright, and I think that bears questioning. But just about everybody on here needs to be questioned. And, you know, just to be thorough, check everybody just for negative checks. But, like, if they're not embolded, then that means they're not in the Henslow thing. But the ones that aren't in the Henslow thing, those early guys, every one of them, super sketched, and they just disappear and die. Or that they, disappear and just quit writing. So, at some point, I guess we got to post this PDF so people can check it out for themselves.
Maybe we can, I think we can upload, if we can download this as a JPEG, I can load it up as just an image link on Imgur or whatever.
Okay.
So everyone can just open this up and just take a look at it for their own reference.
Yeah, and it's, mostly just a visual reference so you can get a time frame for all these folks and where they overlap in their lifetimes. And you can kind of see it as the decades go on. None of them make it to the closing of the theaters, which I think is interesting. So, as much as the closing of the theaters is a sad, tragic time, who cares? All the best ones are gone. Okay, folks. I think that about wraps it up. Any closing thoughts on this one, Brady?
No, just like I said, I'd opened up with a bunch of ways of, how the different claims to the authorship by the different camps can sort of deflate one another during that whole process. And just, I like you said, she's an Oxfordian, but still trying to use some of their good work and approaches to sort of be like, I like all these points you're making, but I feel like we're still, we still need to consider X or Y.
Yeah, we're getting a little tunnel vision here.
And I think she kind of said some ironic statements about, oh, they're only looking for this, and it's like, but I just kind of find it the other way, and I guess we need to admit that, are we a little Sidney biased? Maybe in some cases, but I don't know, it's kind of a lot of, he gives us a lot to go off of. Once again, the second part of poetry is also probably going to be up too. So yeah, just both those parts, and just so many, like I said, Shakespearean moods and tropes and philosophy that he kind of expounds on. And so,
well, and I think part of our Sidney bias is that we want to, as she showed, there's not much to connect Bacon and Oxford, and at this point,
right.
If you're a Shakespeare authorship questioner, Bacon and Oxford are getting pretty unassailable, as far as saying that they're not in Shakespeare. Somebody trying to say neither of them are at all in Shakespeare, I think that's kind of crazy. As far as them being conclusively every word in Shakespeare, one or the other, that hasn't happened. But trying to say that Bacon doesn't have influence or words in Shakespeare, or that Oxford doesn't have influence or words in Shakespeare, I think that's pretty unassailable at this point. And so how can we figure out why their presences are in there, and what the connections are? And I think that's part of the reason that we keep going back to Sidney, is that he may be the link between them,
right?
And
right.
that later Mary Sidney sort of represents that link, but she's just an extension from him being the earlier link. And that since we found that, it's okay, well, what are the odds that he's still around? And honestly, I don't even think that we were oh, we got to find Philip Sidney still alive. It was just more who's this Samuel Daniel guy? And then I looked into Samuel Daniel, wait, no, Philip Sidney should be doing that. I'm no, Philip Sidney would be doing this too, and well, Sidney would be doing this too, and Sidney would be doing, and I don't know, that it was less that I need to make sure that Sidney's alive, and more that Samuel Daniel was just this weird thing, and that since it's okay, well, if he's maybe alive as Samuel Daniel, all this other Sidney stuff started to pop up that wasn't a possibility.
Right.
Which may still sound crazy to folks. Go check out our True Shakespeare Sidney video. But I think that there's something to that.
Or if you're even interested in the idea, if you've seen some of the Wall stuff, and you're oh, John Dee's even a big part of it. Once again, we didn't even know that John Dee and Sidney go way back, and John Dee's Sidney, your dad's my best bro, and Sidney, I'm gonna do this birth chart for you, a horoscope. The only instances that anyone has of me doing this stuff is for Philip Sidney,
Right.
So it's just just some of the Oxford connections are missing, and not to say that, once again, they're all in the Cecil household, and like I said, I think we've been saying from the beginning that it just makes sense that they're all in this sort of pot together.
I know some Oxfordians don't like us saying that Waugh is the singular voice for them, but he is one of the most popular voices for them, and
Alan Green too.
He makes very good arguments, and two of his biggest arguments are that Shakespeare is in love with Penelope Rich, and that Shakespeare is super tied in with John Dee. And so me and Brady are all right, let's go look into Penelope Rich and John Dee. And whose name's pop? It's not Oxford. It's not de Vere. It's Philip Sidney. It's bizarre. It's I didn't go into this oh, I gotta find Sidney.
Exactly.
So,
John Dee's well connected with Sidney. Both sides of Sidney's mom and dad's side.
Yeah.
Obviously connected with Sidney himself, and guess what? He's also another, to double up, the other closest person to Sidney we can find other than Greville is Dyer. Dyer's is super connected to Dee as well.
Right.
And I know some people claiming that, I guess some Baconians say that, well, Bacon is actually Dee, and I don't even know how to begin that route.
Going back to the Oxford to Shakespeare thing, Oxford's best poem that we know as Oxford's, arguably, is a poem called "My Mind to Me a Kingdom Is." Well, other than Oxfordians, I think like the mainstream view outside of Oxfordians is that Edward de Vere wrote that, and so it's like there's just between the Sidney Circle and Oxford, there's this weird amount of overlap where maybe Oxford totally is Shakespeare, but like let's at least negative check against these other guys because they seem to fit the bill pretty good.
Right.
And at some point, like, other than this silly tennis court narrative stuff, like, what's to say that they're not all doing this together because they seem to be in the same circle of people? And, like, I don't know, I've been in fights with friends before. I can still work with them a day or two later, a month later, a year later. Like, I don't have to hate them for my whole life. And
yeah.
It seems like de Vere's too busy hating the new next person anyway. Like, de Vere can't be too busy hating Sidney because he's got to go hate Henry Howard, his cousin. And he can't hate Henry Howard too long because Henry Howard's going to die anyway. And he's got to go hate somebody new. And so, I don't know. Like, I don't think Oxford's one to
dwell.
Yeah, to dwell. Like, he'll hold a grudge as long as it's helpful to him. But, like, as soon as there's something else to, do it better, like, I don't, maybe that's a total misreading, but like that seems to be the gist I get from Oxford. All right, I guess we can close it off here, folks. Hopefully this essay can at least give us a framework, a very general framework, to start to ask questions in a group theory sort of way where we just look at different people, different, as she said, commoner writers, going and looking at Johnson, saying, who the heck is writing Ben Jonson? Because I don't think it's a bricklayer's son. Who the heck is writing Christopher Marlowe? Because I don't think it's a cobble shoemaker's son. Like, I don't, cobbler's son, thank you, cobble shoemaker. So, like, we can also say, hey, Bacon could be one of these guys or more than one of these guys. Philip Sidney could be one of these guys or more than one of these guys. And as Oxfordians have shown, like, a lot of these plays and poems may be coming out of the 70s and 80s. And so even if you want to say that Philip Sidney died, could totally be writing some of those earlier versions. That said, I want to go back to what you said, because we don't mention it till late in that John D. podcast, that chart for Philip Sidney. It's not just some, like, hey, you're born, fortune cookie here. Like, it's very literally the exact life path that he was going to have. Like, when you grow up,
you're going to be awesome. You're going to be this rising star or some crap.
You're going to be this rising star genius that goes around and tells the world all these great things, and
if you're going to be injured by either a sword or bullet or something like that.
Yeah, like in the leg.
Yeah, and he's like, and if you survive, then your fame will be even greater.
Yeah, and you're going to die at 31.
Yeah, and that it would be that age too, and
so, like,
what the heck?
Yeah,
is
like
that?
Either the dude can actually tell fortunes and talks to angels.
Yeah,
which people have made those claims. Or perhaps that this is some long term, predictive programming, building a narrative, like Philip Sidney turning his identity into, like, not too different what celebrities do now. Honestly.
There's got to be some occult philosophy behind creating that persona or going through some kind of, like, it's kind of Masonic thing about the death of the thing.
Ego.
Going and pretending you're getting killed or whatever, and then going in some kind of coffin and then coming back and kind of seeing the light. And so I feel like they're like literally trying to play it out or something.
Phoenix thing too. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, once again. So
which Baconians will totally say that, not every Baconian, but a lot of Baconians will totally say that Anthony Bacon did this in 1603 with the Essex Rebellion. He's supposed to be in prison and supposedly dies of pneumonia, and nobody really knows where he's buried or why, and just disappears from the scene even though he's...
Anthony Bacon does?
Yeah. But then, like, there's all these literary references within Shakespeare and other stuff that, like, I think Anthony Bacon's still alive, and so, like, I don't have enough of the documents in my head internalized to totally be able to relay it out, but it's a pretty compelling argument. Simon Miles does some of it, so if you folks are compelled by that idea, go check out Simon Miles.
The Ghost of Bacon guy may like that, because I was talking with one of their guys, or a guy that he knows or whatever, and I mentioned Anthony Bacon, and he was like, I guess I hadn't considered, his involvement with it too, or whatever. So
how you gonna be a Baconian and not consider Anthony Bacon? Like, you know, like if your brother or my brother turned out to be some great, like, you don't think we had a little influence to do with that? Like, you know, we're their older brother. Like, Anthony is Francis' older brother. Like it's like same kind of distance in years, 2 years. Like,
okay.
Brady and I both have younger brothers that are about 2 years younger than each of us. So, so yeah, the idea that the older brother wasn't like part of that's crazy. That's crazy to me. You know, me and Brady think we're more the Francis than the Anthony, our brothers.
I mean, we are both taller than both of them. You know, much taller than both of them. So
not true. It's not.
It's kind of take that for evidence.
But wrapping it up here, folks. So yeah, it's not just maybe Philip Sidney that we need to look at. Possibly getting past his death date. People did it with Marlowe, and that still may be a viable possibility too. That, like, as Stephanie Hopkins Hughes says, like, maybe I'm wrong, Christopher Marlowe could be totally part of the scene, and if he's faking his death, why the heck couldn't Philip Sidney? Because like, Marlowe's supposed to be doing it through the help of Walsingham. Like, remember, that's Philip Sidney's father-in-law.
Right.
So, like, the guy that put Philip Sidney's funeral and almost bankrupted himself putting together Philip Sidney's funerals. And, the same guy that was getting an annuity from the Queen, the same way that Edward de Vere is getting an annuity from the Queen. Alright, I digress. Okay, so thank you for tuning in, folks. Stay tuned. We're going to come back with more defensive poetry soon. Also going to come with some more movie analysis, movie review kind of stuff. Specifically Shakespeare-related movies, but maybe not only limited to that. And still got to come back with some more sonnet stuff. Roughneck, if you're still tuning in, still got to come at you with my take on Booth and Rausch at some point. But that's now a little bit on the back burner because I'm going into this whole Apocrypha sort of direction. And I've also been trying to, on the side, put down some Shakespeare as well, because I realized with that ranking video we did with 8 plays you need to read that, man, some of those I have not read recently enough to have a good enough opinion or an informed enough opinion on where it should be, because I didn't touch Midsummer Night's Dream, and I don't know, I guess it was like 5+ years, and I didn't realize that, and I was like, yeah, I read that recently. It was just this fruity, frilly play, and I reread it the other day, and I was like, oh my god, this is a freaking masterpiece. Oh my god, like. And so, like, stay tuned for a re-ranking video. I don't know how soon I'm going to get to it, because I definitely, like, need to go through every play.
It'll just have to be a monthly update,
Yeah, here it is re-ranked after I've read these few, yeah. So, yeah, maybe expect that at some point. Any other closing thoughts?
No, not on this one, so I guess we'll just sign off with the usual, motto here, Nullius in verba.